Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into one of the most brutal encounters in all of Greek mythology, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Drop a comment below. It's always amazing to see how far our community of mythology lovers stretches across the globe. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the darker side of ancient legends, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for what we're covering today. Now, when you think of Hercules, what comes to mind? The Disney version with the perfectly sculpted muscles and the happy ending? Maybe the Hollywood action hero who can bench press a mountain? Well, forget everything you think you know about the most famous hero in Greek mythology. Because today we're peeling back the layers of propaganda and revealing the brutal, horrifying reality of what it actually meant to be the son of Zeus. Picture this: you're the strongest man who ever lived. You've got divine blood flowing through your veins. You should be living the dream, right? Wrong, because when you're Hercules, your life isn't an adventure, it's a nightmare wrapped in heroic legend. And nowhere is that more apparent than in his encounter with a creature so vicious, so cunning, that it would ultimately lead to one of the most agonizing deaths ever recorded in ancient literature. I'm talking about Nessus the Centaur, half man, half horse, all monster. This wasn't some noble beast from a fantasy novel. This was a predator who had been terrorizing travelers for decades. And when Hercules crossed paths with him, it set in motion a chain of events so twisted, so psychologically devastating, that it makes modern horror movies look like children's bedtime stories. But here's what's really going to blow your mind. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't some random encounter that went wrong. This was the universe itself conspiring to destroy the greatest hero who ever lived. Because when you're born the son of Zeus, you don't just inherit strength, you inherit enemies, divine enemies, immortal enemies who have all the time in the world to plot your downfall. See, what most people don't realize is that Hercules wasn't just fighting monsters and completing impossible tasks for glory. He was trapped, cursed by Hera, Zeus's jealous wife, to live a life of perpetual torment. Every victory was temporary. Every moment of peace was just the calm before the next storm. And Nessus, this centaur we're about to meet, he was just another weapon in Hera's endless arsenal of revenge. Now, I know what you're thinking. Come on, how bad could it really be? He's Hercules. He's got superhuman strength. He's got divine protection. He's literally half god. But that's exactly the trap that ancient audiences fell into. They saw the legend, not the man. They celebrated the victories, not the cost. And the cost, my friends, was absolutely staggering. By the time Hercules encountered Nessus, he had already been driven temporarily insane by Hera's influence, killing his own wife and children in a fit of madness. He had been enslaved for a year to Queen Omphale, forced to dress as a woman and spin wool while she wore his lion skin. He had completed 12 labors that would have killed any normal man a dozen times over. His body was a roadmap of scars, his mind fractured by trauma, and his soul was hanging by a thread. And this is the state Hercules was in when he faced Nessus. Not the confident hero of legend, but a broken man desperately trying to rebuild his life. He had just married Deianira, a beautiful princess who represented hope for a normal future. For the first time in years, maybe decades, Hercules thought he might actually find peace. But in Greek mythology, hope is the cruelest joke of all. The encounter with Nessus wasn't just about a fight between a hero and a monster. It was about manipulation on a level so sophisticated, so psychologically brutal, that it turned Hercules' greatest strength, his love for his new wife, into the instrument of his own destruction. Nessus didn't just want to hurt Hercules, he wanted to break him completely, irreversibly, and the most terrifying part? He succeeded. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about ancient Greece, it's a masterclass in how evil truly works. Not through brute force or obvious threats, but through deception, through patience, through turning your own virtues against you. Nessus understood something that most villains never figure out. The best way to destroy a hero isn't to be stronger than them, it's to be smarter. Now, before we dive into the horrific details of this encounter, we need to understand exactly what a centaur was in ancient Greek culture, because these weren't the wise, noble creatures you might see in modern fantasy. In the original myths, centaurs were symbols of humanity's worst impulses. They represented the constant war between our civilized nature and our animal instincts. Think about it. Half human, half horse. The top half could think, reason, create art and philosophy. But the bottom half? Pure animal, driven by hunger, lust, and violence. And in most centaurs, the animal half won. They were known for being drunk, aggressive, and completely lacking in self-control. They were what happened when you gave a wild animal human intelligence, but none of human morality. Nessus was all of this and worse. He had been alive for centuries, perfecting his cruelty. He had learned to use his human intelligence not to overcome his animal nature, but to amplify it, to make it more calculating, more patient, more devastating. He wasn't just a monster, he was a monster with a plan, and that plan was about to unfold in the most spectacular way possible. The setting for this encounter was the river Evenus, a rushing waterway that marked the boundary between different territories in ancient Greece. Rivers in mythology weren't just geographical features, they were symbolic barriers. Crossing a river meant entering a new phase of life, often a dangerous one. And for Hercules and his new bride Deianira, crossing this particular river was supposed to be a simple part of their journey to their new home. But nothing in Hercules' life was ever simple. The river was in flood, swollen with winter rains and spring snow melt from the mountains. The current was treacherous, filled with rocks and debris that could easily kill anyone who fell in. For most travelers, crossing would have meant waiting for the waters to recede, possibly for weeks or months. But Hercules wasn't most travelers. His divine strength meant he could probably make it across, even in these conditions. But what about Deianira? She was mortal, fragile compared to her superhuman husband. One slip, one moment of weakness, and she would be swept away and drowned. This is where Nessus made his entrance, and from the very beginning, he positioned himself as the solution to their problem. Nessus operated a ferry service across the river, not out of kindness, mind you. In ancient Greece, controlling river crossings was a profitable business. Travelers had no choice but to pay whatever the ferrymen demanded, or risk their lives in the water. It was legalized extortion, and creatures like Nessus had turned it into an art form. But here's where it gets interesting. Nessus didn't just offer to ferry them across, he specifically offered to carry Deianira on his back, while Hercules swam alongside. On the surface, this seemed reasonable. Centaurs were strong swimmers, and Nessus claimed he knew the river's currents better than anyone. Hercules could focus on his own crossing without worrying about his wife's safety. It was the perfect trap. Reasonable, logical, and absolutely devastating, because what Hercules didn't know was that Nessus had been planning this encounter for years. The Centaur had heard the stories of Hercules' marriage, had tracked their likely route, and had positioned himself at this river crossing specifically to intercept them. This wasn't a chance meeting. This was an ambush disguised as a business transaction. And the bait? Hercules' own love for his wife. You see, Hercules had already lost one family to his curse. The guilt and trauma of killing his first wife and children while under Hera's influence had nearly destroyed him. Deianira represented redemption, a second chance at happiness. The thought of losing her, of failing to protect her, was his greatest fear. Nessus had done his homework. He knew exactly which buttons to push. As they negotiated the river crossing, Nessus played his part perfectly. He was respectful, professional, even slightly deferential to the great hero. He quoted reasonable prices for his services. He demonstrated his knowledge of the river's dangers. He even offered testimonials from previous satisfied customers. Everything about the interaction was designed to make Hercules lower his guard. And it worked. Looking back, knowing what we know now, it's easy to criticize Hercules for falling for such an obvious trap. But put yourself in his position. You're trying to start a new life with the woman you love. You've been traveling for days, you're tired, and you encounter what seems like a legitimate solution to a real problem. The alternative is risking your wife's life in a dangerous river crossing. What would you do? Hercules made the choice that any loving husband would make. He accepted Nessus's offer. He watched as his new wife climbed onto the centaur's back, trusting in the creature's promise to deliver her safely to the other side. Then he dove into the raging waters himself, fighting the current with every ounce of his superhuman strength. And that's when Nessus showed his true nature. The moment Hercules was committed to the water, struggling against the fierce current and unable to change course, Nessus began to veer off the agreed-upon path. Instead of heading directly across the river, he started angling downstream toward a secluded bend where thick trees provided cover from prying eyes. Deianira, riding on the Centaur's back, was the first to realize something was wrong. She called out to Nessus, asking why they weren't heading straight across. His response chilled her blood. He wasn't planning to deliver her safely to her husband, he was planning to keep her for himself. The psychological cruelty of this moment cannot be overstated. Deianira was trapped on the back of a creature that was half-wild animal, miles from any help, watching her husband grow smaller and smaller in the distance as he fought the river's current. She was completely at Nessus's mercy, and they both knew he had none to give. This wasn't just attempted kidnapping. In ancient Greek culture, what Nessus was planning was considered one of the most heinous crimes possible. The violation of guest friendship, the betrayal of trust, the assault on a married woman, all combined into a single act of monstrous evil. But Nessus had miscalculated. Badly. Because while Hercules might have been in the middle of a raging river, he wasn't helpless. His divine heritage included more than just superhuman strength. It also included supernatural senses and reflexes that allowed him to perceive threats from impossible distances. He heard his wife's cries for help. He saw the Centaur changing course. And in that moment, all the rage and frustration of his cursed life focused into a single point of white-hot fury. Hercules had spent years being manipulated by the gods, tormented by Hera, forced to complete impossible tasks, and driven to commit unspeakable acts against his own family. He had endured slavery, humiliation, and endless suffering. But this attack on his wife, on his chance at redemption, this was the final straw. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. But it would also seal Hercules' fate in ways that no one, not even the gods themselves, could have predicted. Because Nessus, for all his cunning, had made one critical error. He assumed that distance would protect him from Hercules' wrath. He thought that being in the middle of a river would give him time to complete his crime before the hero could respond. He was catastrophically wrong. The moment Hercules realized what was happening, something primal awakened within him. This wasn't the controlled strength he used to complete his labors or the measured force he applied in combat. This was pure, undiluted rage channeled through divine muscle and bone. Still fighting the river's current, Hercules reached for his bow. Now you might think this is impossible. How do you draw a bow while swimming in a raging river? How do you aim while being tossed around by rapids? For any mortal man, it would be laughably absurd to even attempt. But Hercules wasn't mortal. Not entirely. His father, Zeus, had gifted him with abilities that transcended normal human limitations. His hands could maintain perfect steadiness even while his body was being battered by the current. His eyes could track a target with supernatural precision even through spray and chaos. And his strength, his incredible strength, could drive an arrow with enough force to punch through solid stone. The bow itself was no ordinary weapon. Crafted by Apollo, the god of archery, it was strung with sinew from the Nemean lion, the first monster Hercules had killed during his labors. The arrows were tipped with bronze forged in the fires of Hephaestus and had been dipped in the venomous blood of the Hydra, another of his conquered foes. Every piece of his equipment was a trophy, a reminder of victories won through blood and suffering. And now, all of that accumulated power was about to be unleashed on a single target. Nessus, meanwhile, was growing more confident by the second. He had covered significant distance from the original crossing point, and Hercules seemed to be struggling more and more with the treacherous current. The Centaur's animal instincts were taking over completely now. He could smell his victim's fear, could feel her trembling on his back, and it only excited him more. This is what separated Nessus from the typical monster. Most creatures of his type were driven by simple hunger or territorial instinct. They killed because they needed food or because something had invaded their domain. But Nessus was different. He derived genuine pleasure from the terror of his victims. The psychological torture was as important to him as the physical violation that would follow. He began describing to Deianira exactly what he planned to do with her once they reached his hidden lair. The details were so graphic, so utterly depraved that ancient writers could barely bring themselves to record them. This wasn't just about satisfying his animal urges. This was about completely destroying another person's humanity, reducing them to nothing more than a plaything for his twisted amusement. Deianira, to her credit, didn't collapse into helpless panic. She had been raised in a warrior culture where both men and women were expected to face death with dignity. Instead of begging or pleading, she began planning her own resistance. She knew that once they reached shore, she would have only moments to act before Nessus overpowered her completely. But she also knew it probably wouldn't matter. Centaurs were incredibly strong, and Nessus had the added advantage of size and experience. He had done this before, many times. The bones of his previous victims littered his lair like trophies, each one representing a life destroyed for nothing more than his momentary pleasure. This was the reality that Deianira faced as she rode on the back of a monster toward her own destruction. And this was the sight that greeted Hercules as he finally managed to angle himself for a clear shot. What he saw would have broken a lesser man's sanity. His wife, the symbol of his hope for redemption, being carried away by a creature that embodied everything evil about the world. The parallels to his first family were impossible to ignore. Once again, the people he loved most were being threatened by forces beyond their control. Once again, he was faced with the possibility of losing everything that mattered to him. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't under Hera's influence. This time, his mind was clear and his purpose was pure. He wasn't being driven by madness or manipulation. He was being driven by love, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. The arrow that Hercules nocked was special even among his supernatural arsenal. It had been forged specifically for killing immortal creatures, its bronze tip alloyed with metals from the depths of Tartarus itself. The Hydra's venom coating the point was so potent that even the gods feared its touch. A single scratch from this weapon could kill a titan, but Hercules faced a problem that would have paralyzed any normal archer. The shot was impossible by every rational measure. He was still partially submerged in churning water, being pushed around by currents that could snap a normal man's spine. His target was moving rapidly and erratically, dodging between trees and rocks as Nessus sought cover. The distance was extreme, well beyond the effective range of most bows, and he had exactly one chance. Miss and his wife would disappear forever into the wilderness, subjected to torments that would make death seem like mercy. Hit, but fail to kill instantly, and Nessus might have time to snap Deianira's neck in retaliation. There was no room for error, no possibility of a second attempt. This was the moment that would define not just the encounter, but Hercules' entire legacy. Everything he had endured, every trial he had overcome, every skill he had developed, all of it had been leading to this single arrow shot. He drew the bowstring back to his ear, feeling the familiar tension of the divine weapon. The Nemean lion sinew stretched taut, storing enough energy to drive the arrow through a mountain if necessary. His divine senses expanded outward, calculating wind speed, distance, trajectory, the motion of his target, the sway of the trees, even the subtle gravitational pull of the moon overhead. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Hercules could see individual droplets of water flying through the air around him. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong despite the chaos surrounding him. He could feel the arrow's weight, perfectly balanced and eager to fly. Most importantly, he could see Nessus's face. The centaur had turned slightly, perhaps sensing the danger behind him, and for just a moment their eyes met across the distance. In that instant, Nessus understood that he had made a terrible mistake. The fear that flashed across his features was almost satisfying. Almost, because what Hercules felt in that moment wasn't satisfaction. It was the cold, calculating focus of a predator about to eliminate a threat. There was no anger now, no rage, no emotion at all, just pure, crystalline purpose. He released the arrow. The shot was perfect. More than perfect, it was supernatural. The arrow flew in a straight line that defied physics, cutting through air and space as if reality itself was bending to accommodate its passage. It struck Nessus exactly where Hercules had intended, punching through the centaur's back and emerging from his chest in a spray of dark blood. But this wasn't just any arrow wound. The Hydra's venom began working immediately, spreading through Nessus's immortal bloodstream like liquid fire. The centaur's scream of agony echoed across the valley, a sound so terrible that birds fell dead from the trees and fish floated belly up in the river. Nessus collapsed instantly, his legs giving out beneath him as the poison attacked his nervous system. Deianira was thrown clear, landing hard on the rocky shore but miraculously uninjured. She scrambled to her feet and began running back toward her husband, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the dying monster. But Nessus wasn't finished. Even as the venom coursed through his veins, even as his immortal body began to shut down, his mind remained sharp. And in those final moments, as death approached for the first time in his centuries of existence, he conceived a plan so diabolically clever that it would make even the gods pause in admiration. You see, Nessus understood something that Hercules, in his moment of triumph, had forgotten. The Centaur had lived for hundreds of years. He had studied human nature with the patience and focus of a true predator. He knew that heroes, especially heroes like Hercules, had predictable weaknesses. And the greatest weakness of all was love. As Deianira ran past his dying form, Nessus called out to her in a voice made weak by approaching death. He told her that he was sorry, that he had been overcome by her beauty and had acted shamefully. He begged her forgiveness and claimed that he wanted to make amends for his terrible crime. It was a performance worthy of the greatest actors in Athens. Every word was calculated to appeal to Deianira's compassionate nature. Every pause was timed to suggest genuine remorse. Even his physical posture, collapsed and broken, reinforced the image of a repentant sinner seeking absolution. And then came the masterstroke. Nessus told Deianira that he possessed a love potion, created from his own blood, mixed with the Hydra's venom from Hercules' arrow. He claimed that this mixture had magical properties that could ensure her husband's eternal faithfulness. If she ever suspected Hercules of straying, if she ever worried about losing his love, she need only apply this potion to his clothing, and his devotion would be renewed forever. It was a lie built on a foundation of truth, which made it infinitely more dangerous. Centaur blood did have magical properties in Greek mythology. The Hydra's venom was indeed supernaturally potent, and Hercules, given his divine nature and his history of multiple marriages, might indeed be susceptible to wandering affections. More importantly, Deianira had grown up hearing stories of heroes who abandoned their wives for younger, more beautiful women. She knew that Hercules' first marriage had ended in tragedy, and she had no guarantee that their relationship would be any different. The offer of a magical insurance policy against abandonment was almost irresistible. But the real genius of Nessus's deception lay in its psychological sophistication. He wasn't asking Deianira to use the potion immediately. He wasn't suggesting that Hercules was currently unfaithful. Instead, he was planting a seed of doubt that would grow over time, watered by every moment of uncertainty, every glance her husband gave to another woman, every day he spent away from home. The potion itself was actually pure poison, concentrated Hydra venom mixed with Nessus's own toxic blood. It would kill anyone who came into contact with it, slowly and agonizingly. But Deianira didn't know that. All she knew was that a dying centaur was offering her a way to guarantee her husband's love forever. In her defense, Deianira wasn't stupid or gullible. She was a princess, educated and intelligent, raised in a culture that valued strategic thinking. But she was also a woman in love, a woman who had just experienced the terror of being kidnapped and nearly violated. Her emotional state was fragile, her judgment compromised by trauma and relief. And Nessus, even dying, was still a master manipulator. As Hercules finally reached the shore, having fought his way through the treacherous current, he found his wife kneeling beside the centaur's body. Nessus was barely alive, his breathing shallow and labored, his eyes already beginning to glaze over. The Hydra's venom had done its work efficiently, shutting down his immortal systems one by one. But he managed one final whisper to Deianira, just loud enough for her to hear, but too quiet for Hercules to make out the words. He pressed a small vial into her hands, his blood mixed with the venom from the arrow that had killed him. Then he smiled, an expression of such pure malevolence that it should have warned her of the trap she was walking into. Instead, she slipped the vial into her robes and said nothing to her husband about the centaur's final gift. Nessus died with that smile on his lips, secure in the knowledge that his revenge would outlive him by years. He had turned Hercules' greatest strength, his capacity for love, into a weapon that would eventually destroy him. The hero's perfect shot, the arrow that had saved his wife and eliminated a terrible threat, had also delivered the instrument of his own doom directly into the hands of the person he trusted most. It was a plan so elegant, so perfectly crafted, that even Hera herself couldn't have conceived it. And the most beautiful part, from Nessus's perspective, was that Hercules would never see it coming. The great hero, the slayer of monsters, the son of Zeus himself, would be brought low not by superior strength or divine intervention, but by the simple, human emotion of jealousy. The vial of poison now rested against Deianira's heart, waiting for the moment when doubt would overcome love, when fear would triumph over trust. And when that moment came, the real tragedy would begin. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Hercules held his wife close, grateful beyond words that he had been able to save her. He thought the crisis was over, the monster defeated, the threat eliminated. He had no idea that the real danger had just begun. As they resumed their journey, leaving Nessus's body to be consumed by scavengers, neither of them spoke about what had just happened. Hercules was lost in his own thoughts, replaying the impossible shot that had saved his wife's life. Deianira walked beside him in silence, one hand unconsciously touching the hidden vial that pressed against her ribs with each step. The river crossing that was supposed to mark the beginning of their new life together had instead set in motion the events that would end it. The encounter with Nessus was over, but its consequences would echo through the years to come, growing stronger with each passing day until they finally erupted in a crescendo of agony that would make the Centaur's death seem merciful by comparison. Because in the end, that's what made Nessus truly terrifying. He wasn't just a monster who threatened people's bodies. He was a monster who could corrupt their souls, who could turn love into hatred, trust into suspicion, and hope into despair. His real weapon wasn't his physical strength or his animal cunning. His real weapon was time. And time, as Hercules and Deianira would soon discover, was the most patient predator of all. The months that followed their encounter with Nessus should have been the happiest of Hercules' cursed existence. He had found love again, built a home far from the political machinations of the gods, and for the first time in decades he could sleep without nightmares of his past. Sins haunting his dreams, Deianira proved to be everything he had hoped for in a wife. She was intelligent, compassionate, and strong enough to handle the reality of being married to a man whose very existence attracted divine attention and mortal enemies. But beneath this surface of domestic bliss, something was rotting. The vial that Nessus had given Deianira remained hidden in her jewelry box, wrapped in silk and tucked away behind necklaces and earrings. She told herself she would never need to use it, that her husband's love was genuine and eternal. But late at night, when Hercules was away on one of his adventures or helping distant kingdoms with their monster problems, she would take out the vial and hold it up to the lamplight. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, with an oily consistency that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Sometimes she thought she could see shapes moving within it, writhing and twisting like tiny serpents. But when she looked closer, there was nothing there. Just her imagination, surely, just the flickering shadows cast by the flame. What Deianira didn't understand was that the vial contained more than just poison. The Hydra's venom that had killed Nessus was legendary for its potency, but when mixed with Centaur blood and concentrated by magical processes, it became something far more sinister. It became a substance that could corrupt not just flesh, but spirit, and even sealed away in its container, it was already beginning to work on her mind. The corruption was subtle at first, a stray thought here, a moment of uncertainty there. When Hercules returned from helping a neighboring kingdom deal with a plague of harpies, Deianira found herself studying his face for signs of deception. Had he really been fighting monsters, or had he been visiting the beautiful queen who had requested his aid? When he spoke of his adventures, was there something he wasn't telling her? These doubts were completely unfounded. Hercules, scarred by the tragedy of his first family, was obsessively faithful to his new wife. He turned down invitations to royal banquets where attractive women might be present. He avoided situations that could even appear compromising. His love for Deianira had become the one pure thing in his life, the single source of happiness in an existence defined by suffering and loss. But poisoned thoughts, like poisoned arrows, don't need to be based in reality to find their mark. As the seasons turned and their marriage entered its second year, Deianira's suspicions began to crystallize around a specific target. Her name was Iole, a princess from the island kingdom of Ochalia. She was young, beautiful, and according to the stories that reached Deianira's ears, she had captured the attention of many heroes throughout Greece. The truth about Iole was far more complex and tragic than the rumors suggested. She was indeed beautiful, but she was also a prisoner of war, captured when Hercules had been forced to sack her father's city over a matter of honor and betrayal that had nothing to do with romance. Her entire family had been killed in the siege. Her homeland had been reduced to ash and rubble. She had lost everything and everyone she had ever loved. Hercules, recognizing her noble birth and tragic circumstances, had taken her into his household as a protected guest rather than a slave. It was an act of mercy, a way of honoring the brave resistance her family had shown during the siege. He treated her with the respect due to fallen royalty, ensuring she had proper quarters, appropriate clothing, and the freedom to come and go as she pleased within his estates. But to Deianira, increasingly influenced by the dark magic seeping from that hidden vial, these acts of kindness looked like something else entirely. Every courtesy Hercules showed to Iole was evidence of secret affection. Every conversation between them was proof of a developing romance. Every moment he spent in the young woman's presence was a betrayal of their marriage vows. The psychological torture that Nessus had designed was working exactly as he had planned. The Centaur had understood that jealousy was like a slow-acting poison, building in strength over time until it overwhelmed all rational thought. He had counted on Deianira's love for her husband to become the very weapon that would destroy him. And the most insidious part of the trap was that Deianira's fears weren't entirely without foundation. Not because Hercules was actually unfaithful, but because the pattern she feared had played out countless times throughout Greek mythology. Heroes routinely abandoned their wives for younger women. Gods and mortals alike treated marriage as a temporary convenience rather than a sacred bond. In a culture where powerful men could take multiple wives and countless concubines without social censure, Deianira's anxieties reflected genuine vulnerabilities that every woman of her era faced. Nessus had weaponized her very real fears about her place in a patriarchal society where women could be discarded at will. The breaking point came during the Festival of Zeus, when delegations from across Greece gathered at Hercules' estate to honor his divine father. Among the visitors were several young princesses and noblewomen, all eager to meet the famous hero and perhaps catch his eye. They flirted shamelessly, offering gifts and praise, competing for his attention with the ruthless efficiency of seasoned courtiers. Hercules, uncomfortable with such displays, tried to deflect their advances by praising his wife's beauty and virtue. But to Deianira, watching from the shadows of the great hall, his polite responses looked like encouragement. When he smiled at a joke told by a particularly persistent princess, Deianira saw romantic interest. When he accepted a gift of wine from a young queen, she interpreted it as a token of affection, but it was his interaction with Iole that finally shattered her composure. The young woman had been standing alone near the edge of the celebration, clearly uncomfortable with the revelry that surrounded her. As a prisoner of war, she had no allies among the gathered nobles, no family to protect her interests, no resources beyond Hercules' continued mercy. When a group of drunk young nobles began making crude comments about her beauty and speculating about her relationship with their host, she had nowhere to turn for protection. Hercules noticed her distress and immediately intervened. He publicly rebuked the men who had been harassing her, reminded the entire gathering that she was under his protection, and personally escorted her to a quieter part of the estate where she could avoid unwanted attention. It was exactly what any honorable host should have done for a vulnerable guest. But Deianira saw something different. She saw her husband rushing to defend another woman's honor while barely acknowledging her own presence at the feast. She saw him taking Iole's arm with gentle care, speaking to her in low, reassuring tones, treating her with a tenderness that seemed more intimate than protective. In that moment, watching her husband comfort another woman while she stood ignored among the crowd, something snapped inside Deianira's mind. The slow poison of jealousy that had been building for months suddenly reached critical mass. All rational thought evaporated, replaced by a burning need to reclaim her husband's affection before it was too late. She slipped away from the celebration and made her way to her private chambers. Her hands shook as she opened her jewelry box and retrieved the vial that Nessus had given her. The liquid inside seemed darker than before, more viscous, as if it had been growing stronger during its long concealment. When she held it up to the light, she could swear she saw faces in its depths, screaming faces, twisted in agony. But those were just shadows, she told herself, just tricks of the flickering flame. The Centaur's instructions had been simple. Apply the mixture to something Hercules would wear close to his skin, and his love for her would be renewed and strengthened forever. It seemed like such a small thing, such a harmless bit of insurance. What could it hurt to try? She chose a shirt that she had woven for him herself, a garment of fine white linen decorated with gold thread in patterns that told the story of their courtship. It was one of his favorites, something he wore for special occasions and important ceremonies. The symbolism seemed perfect. She would restore their love using a gift that represented the best moments of their marriage. Working by candlelight, Deianira carefully opened the vial and began applying its contents to the shirt. The liquid was cold to the touch, colder than ice, and it seemed to eat into the fabric rather than merely staining it. Where it touched the linen, the material took on a strange, oily sheen that shifted and moved in the flickering light. As she worked, Deianira began to feel dizzy. The room seemed to spin around her, and strange whispers echoed in her ears. For a moment, she thought she could hear Nessus laughing, his voice carrying impossible distance across the years that separated his death from this moment. She shook her head, attributing the sensation to nerves and excitement. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice what was happening to her hands. The Hydra's venom, even in its diluted form, was beginning to eat through her skin. Tiny blisters formed on her fingertips where she had touched the poisoned fabric. The pain was sharp and immediate, like touching a red-hot coal, but she ignored it in her eagerness to complete her work. Only when she was finished did she look down and see the damage. Her hands were covered in angry red welts that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. The skin was already beginning to blacken and peel away, revealing raw flesh underneath. She tried to wash the poison off, but water only seemed to spread it further up her arms. For the first time since Nessus's death, Deianira began to suspect that she had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late. The shirt was ready, soaked with enough concentrated venom to kill a dozen men, and tomorrow, Hercules was scheduled to perform a public sacrifice to Zeus, and ceremony where tradition demanded he wear his finest clothes. He would put on the poisoned garment in front of hundreds of witnesses, and then Nessus's revenge would finally be complete. As Deianira sat in her chamber, watching the flesh slowly dissolve from her hands, she finally understood the true nature of the gift the Centaur had given her. It wasn't a love potion, it was a weapon, and she had just used it to murder the man she loved more than life itself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She collapsed to the floor, screaming in anguish that had nothing to do with the poison eating through her skin. She had been played, manipulated, used as an instrument of revenge by a creature whose hatred transcended death itself. Her love, her fears, her very humanity had all been twisted into tools for destruction. But there was no way to take it back. The shirt lay folded on her table, innocent-looking and perfectly prepared. In a few hours, servants would come to collect it for the ceremony. They would present it to Hercules as a gift from his loving wife. He would put it on without suspicion, trusting in her devotion just as she had trusted in Nessus's lies. And then the real horror would begin, because the Hydra's venom didn't just kill. It killed slowly, agonizingly, eating through flesh and bone while keeping its victim conscious and aware throughout the entire process. Hercules would have time to understand what was happening to him, time to realize that his own wife had become the instrument of his destruction, time to experience betrayal and physical agony in equal measure. It would be the perfect revenge, not just death, but the complete destruction of everything good in Hercules' life. His faith in love, his trust in others, his hope for redemption, all of it would be consumed along with his flesh. Nessus had planned this moment with the patience of a master strategist and the cruelty of a true monster. Even in death, he was still the predator, still the hunter of human weakness and vulnerability. The encounter at the river had never been about kidnapping Deianira or satisfying animal lust. It had been about setting in motion a chain of events that would destroy Hercules more completely than any monster or labor ever could. As dawn approached and servants began stirring in the lower levels of the estate, Deianira faced a choice that would define the rest of her brief life. She could confess what she had done, warn Hercules about the poisoned shirt, and face his rage and disappointment, or she could remain silent, let events unfold as Nessus had planned, and watch the man she loved die in the most horrible way imaginable. But there was a third option, one that the Centaur had probably never considered, one that would deny him his final victory and spare Hercules at least some of the agony that awaited him. Deianira looked at her ruined hands, at the flesh that continued to bubble and dissolve despite her attempts to wash away the poison. The venom was spreading up her arms now, eating its way toward her heart. She had perhaps an hour before it reached vital organs and finished its work. an hour to make amends for the greatest mistake of her life. She picked up her writing materials with fingers that could barely hold a pen and began composing what she knew would be her final letter. Every word was agony to write, not just because of the physical pain, but because of the emotional devastation of admitting what she had done. She explained everything: Nessus's deception, the supposed love potion, her own jealousy and fear, the terrible truth about the shirt that even now awaited her husband. When the letter was complete, she sealed it with wax and her personal signet, then placed it prominently on the table where it could not be missed. Then she walked to the window and looked out over the estate that had been her home, the place where she had experienced the only real happiness of her adult life. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the fire she had once thought burned eternal in her husband's eyes. Soon, servants would discover her body and the letter that would save his life. He would hate her for what she had almost done, but he would live. He would survive to love again, to find the happiness that her jealousy had nearly destroyed. It wasn't redemption, not really. Nothing could undo the betrayal she had committed or the trust she had shattered. But it was something, a final act of love to balance the scales against her moment of ultimate failure. Deianira pressed her lips to the window glass in a final farewell kiss to the world she was leaving behind. Then she turned away from the sunrise and walked deliberately toward the balcony that overlooked the courtyard far below. The impact, when it came, was mercifully brief, but her death would echo through the ages as a reminder of how even the purest love could be corrupted, how the greatest heroes could be brought low not by superior enemies, but by the simple human frailties of those they trusted most. Nessus had won after all, not completely, not in the way he had originally planned, but decisively enough. He had destroyed a marriage, driven a woman to suicide, and robbed Hercules of yet another chance at happiness. The great hero would live, but he would carry the scars of this betrayal for the rest of his immortal existence. And somewhere in whatever dark realm contained the spirits of the damned, a centaur's laughter echoed through eternity, celebrating a victory that had taken years to achieve but would last forever. The encounter at the river Evenus was over. The real tragedy had only just begun. But that's a story for another day, because what happened next would make everything we've discussed so far look like a gentle bedtime story. The poisoned shirt, the attempted murder, the suicide of a desperate wife, all of it was just the opening act in a drama so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that it would redefine what it meant to suffer in the ancient world. Because Hercules didn't just lose his wife that day, he lost his faith in love itself. And a man with divine strength and no reason left to live, that's not a hero anymore. That's something much more dangerous. The discovery of Deianira's broken body in the courtyard sent shockwaves through Hercules' household that would reverberate for generations. Her letter, found beside the bloodstains on her chamber floor, revealed the full scope of Nessus's posthumous revenge in words so filled with anguish that the servants who first read it wept openly. But it was Hercules' reaction that truly demonstrated the psychological devastation the Centaur had achieved. When they brought him the news, the great hero didn't rage or weep or display any of the dramatic emotions you might expect. Instead, he went completely silent. For 3 full days, he sat beside his wife's body without speaking, without eating, without acknowledging the world around him. Those who dared to approach said his eyes looked like empty windows in a house where everyone had died. You see, this wasn't just grief. This was the complete collapse of a man who had finally allowed himself to believe in happiness, only to have it torn away by the very person he trusted most. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He had survived the wrath of gods, the fury of monsters, the impossible labors that should have killed him a dozen times over. But he had been brought to his knees by something as simple and human as jealousy. The poisoned shirt still hung in his wardrobe, waiting. The servants had found it exactly where Deianira had left it, looking perfectly innocent except for the strange, oily sheen that seemed to move in the light. Even the bravest among them refused to touch it directly, using tongs and thick gloves to move it to a secure location. They could smell the death radiating from the fabric, a sweet, cloying odor that reminded them of flowers blooming in a graveyard. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because as Hercules sat in his silent vigil, something fundamental changed inside him. The man who had once been motivated by honor, by duty, by love for his fellow humans, began to transform into something else entirely. The divine blood that flowed through his veins, the same blood that had given him superhuman strength, now began to carry something far more dangerous: pure, undiluted hatred, not just for Nessus, though the Centaur's memory burned in his mind like acid, not just for the gods who had cursed him to this existence of perpetual loss, but for the entire world that had conspired to make his life a masterpiece of suffering, every person who had ever asked for his help, every city he had saved, every monster he had slain in service to ungrateful mortals who would never understand the cost of their salvation. What was the point of being a hero in a world where love itself was a weapon that could be turned against you? The transformation wasn't immediate. For weeks after Deianira's funeral, Hercules maintained the facade of his former self. He received visitors who came to pay their respects. He listened to requests for aid from distant kingdoms facing their own monster problems. He even agreed to several new labors, though those who knew him well noticed that something essential had gone out of his eyes. But beneath the surface, a new philosophy was taking root. If the world was determined to make him suffer, then perhaps it was time to return the favor. If love was a liability that would always be used against him, then maybe it was time to embrace something more reliable, like fear. The first sign of this change came when a delegation from the kingdom of Lycia arrived seeking help with a fire-breathing monster called the Chimera. Normally, Hercules would have accepted such a quest immediately, driven by his natural desire to protect the innocent. This time, he listened to their pleas with the cold calculation of a merchant evaluating a business proposition. What could they offer him in return? Gold was meaningless to someone with divine strength. Fame meant nothing to a man who had already achieved legendary status. Political power? He had turned down kingdoms before. But there was something they possessed that interested him greatly: information. You see, Hercules had begun to understand that his greatest weakness wasn't physical vulnerability or even emotional attachment. It was ignorance. He had spent his entire life reacting to threats, responding to crises, cleaning up messes created by forces beyond his control. He had never been the one making the plans, setting the traps, manipulating events from behind the scenes. That was about to change. The Lycians possessed ancient records, scrolls that contained detailed information about every monster in their region of the world. Not just their locations and capabilities, but their histories, their weaknesses, their connections to other creatures and supernatural forces. It was intelligence that could be weaponized, turned into a tool for proactive rather than reactive heroism. Hercules agreed to kill their chimera, but his terms were unprecedented. He wanted complete access to their archives. He wanted copies of every scroll, every map, every genealogical chart that traced the bloodlines of monsters back to their divine origins, and he wanted it all delivered to his estate before he would even consider beginning the quest. The Lycians, desperate for his aid, agreed without understanding what they were unleashing. They saw a grieving hero making unusual demands and assumed it was part of his mourning process. They had no idea they were helping to arm the most dangerous man in the world with the information that would make him unstoppable. Because that's what Hercules was becoming. Not unstoppable in the sense of raw power, though he certainly possessed that. Unstoppable in the sense of strategic thinking, of long-term planning, of the kind of patient, methodical approach to problem solving that had been Nessus's greatest strength. He was learning from his enemies. The hunt for the Chimera should have been straightforward. The creature was powerful but predictable, following patterns of behavior that hadn't changed in centuries. Previous heroes who had faced similar monsters had relied on courage, skill, and divine favor to achieve victory through direct confrontation. Hercules took a different approach. He spent weeks studying the creature's habits, mapping its territory, identifying its food sources, and nesting sites. He interviewed survivors of its attacks, not just to understand its capabilities, but to identify the psychological factors that made it choose certain victims over others. He analyzed the creature's divine parentage, tracing its lineage back through generations of mythological beings to understand what motivated it on a fundamental level. What he discovered was fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. The Chimera wasn't just a mindless destroyer, it was intelligent, perhaps more intelligent than most humans. Its attacks weren't random acts of bestial fury, but calculated strikes designed to maximize terror and despair. It chose its victims based on their emotional significance to their communities. It killed beloved leaders, talented artisans, promising young people whose deaths would leave the deepest psychological wounds. In other words, the Chimera was doing exactly what Nessus had done, using psychological warfare to inflict damage that went far beyond the physical. The realization hit Hercules like a lightning bolt. He had been thinking about monsters all wrong his entire life. He had assumed they were simple predators driven by hunger or territorial instinct. But the truth was far more complex. Many of them were sophisticated psychological operators who understood human nature better than humans understood themselves. They weren't just threats to be eliminated. They were teachers to be studied. Instead of charging in with sword and bow, Hercules began a campaign of psychological warfare against the Chimera that would have impressed Sun Tzu himself. He started by disrupting the creature's food supply, systematically hunting down and eliminating the large game animals it preferred, not to starve it, but to force it to change its hunting patterns, to make it predictable in new ways. Then he began manipulating its territory, using controlled fires and strategic rock slides to channel its movements along specific paths. He planted false evidence of his presence in areas where he wanted the creature to search for him, while actually preparing his real ambush site miles away. Most importantly, he studied the Chimera's psychological profile until he understood exactly what would enrage it beyond all rational thought. The creature took pride in being feared, in being the apex predator of its region. So Hercules began a campaign of humiliation that struck at that pride like arrows aimed at the heart. He started small, stealing kills from the Chimera, taking down prey animals just moments before the monster could claim them. Then he escalated, leaving taunting messages carved into trees and rocks throughout the creature's territory. Not threats or challenges, but mockery. Jokes about its appearance, its hunting skills, its intelligence. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Chimera abandoned its careful, methodical approach to hunting and began searching frantically for the source of these insults. It grew careless, taking risks it would never have contemplated before, driven by a fury that clouded its judgment. And that's when Hercules struck. But this wasn't the straightforward battle that legends would later describe. This was an execution, carried out with the cold efficiency of a professional assassin. The Chimera never had a chance to fight back, never got the opportunity to display its legendary ferocity. It died confused and helpless, brought low not by superior strength, but by superior strategy. As Hercules stood over the creature's cooling corpse, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Deianira's death. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of completeness. This was what he had been meant to do all along, not react to threats, but eliminate them before they could become threats. Not wait for monsters to terrorize innocents, but hunt them down with the same methodical precision they used against their victims. He was no longer just a hero, he was becoming something new, something the world had never seen before and wasn't prepared to handle. A monster hunter who thought like a monster. The transformation accelerated from there. Each new quest became an opportunity to refine his methods, to experiment with new approaches to the ancient problem of evil in the world. He began seeking out information about creatures that hadn't yet become active threats, studying them, mapping their territories, preparing contingency plans for their eventual elimination. But it wasn't enough to simply kill monsters. He needed to understand the system that created them, the divine politics and supernatural forces that allowed such creatures to exist in the first place. And that meant going after bigger targets than individual beasts. He started investigating the genealogies of monster families, tracing bloodlines back to their divine origins. What he found was a network of immortal beings who treated mortal suffering as entertainment, who created new horrors for their own amusement or as weapons in their eternal conflicts with one another. The gods themselves were the real monsters. Everything else was just their handiwork. This realization should have been devastating to someone raised to honor the divine. But Hercules had moved beyond such simple concepts as respect for authority or fear of retribution. His own father Zeus had already demonstrated that divine love was conditional at best, abandoning his half-mortal son to face Hera's wrath alone. The other gods had shown their true nature through centuries of cruelty and indifference. If they wanted to play games with mortal lives, then perhaps it was time someone changed the rules. The first target he selected was carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. Echidna, the mother of monsters, had been spawning new horrors for millennia from her lair deep in the earth. She was ancient, powerful, and protected by layers of divine law that made her theoretically untouchable. Theoretically. But Hercules had learned something that the gods had forgotten in their arrogance. Rules could be broken if you understood them well enough. Treaties could be voided if you found the right loopholes. Even divine law had weaknesses if you were patient enough to find them. It took him 3 years to plan the assault on Echidna's lair. 3 years of careful research, strategic positioning, and psychological preparation. He studied every monster she had ever created, mapping their weaknesses back to flaws in her own divine essence. He traced the legal precedents that protected her, looking for contradictions and exceptions that could be exploited. Most importantly, he prepared himself mentally for what he was about to become. Because killing Echidna wouldn't just be regicide, it would be a declaration of war against the entire cosmic order. Once he crossed that line, there would be no going back to the simple life of a traveling hero. He would become something unprecedented in the history of the world, a mortal who dared to hunt gods. The assault itself was a masterpiece of tactical planning. Echidna had surrounded herself with layers of protection, both physical and magical. Her lair was defended by an army of her offspring, creatures of every size and description imaginable. The approaches were trapped with snares that had been perfected over millennia. The very air around her domain was poisonous to mortal lungs, but Hercules had prepared for all of it. He had studied each defending monster individually, developing specific strategies for their elimination. He had mapped every trap, found ways to turn them against their creators. He had even found ways to purify the poisoned atmosphere, using techniques learned from his encounters with creatures like the Hydra. When he finally reached Echidna's inner sanctum, she was waiting for him, not with fear or anger, but with something approaching respect. She had watched his approach through the senses of her children, had observed his methodical dismantling of her defenses. She understood, perhaps better than he did himself, what he had become. "You're not here for justice," she said, her voice carrying the weight of eons. "You're not even here for revenge. You're here because you finally understood the truth about this world." Hercules nodded, his hand steady on his weapon. "The truth that you and your kind create suffering for sport. The truth that mortals are nothing more than toys to you." "The truth," Echidna replied, "that the only way to stop a monster is to become something worse." She was right, and they both knew it. The hero who had once wept over the necessity of violence had died in Deianira's chambers. What stood before the mother of monsters now was something new, something that the world would soon learn to fear more than any creature she had ever spawned, because monsters, at least, were predictable. They followed their nature, acted according to their programming, could be understood and countered by those brave enough to study them. But what do you do when the monster hunter becomes the monster? What do you do when the greatest hero in history decides that salvation requires damnation, that the only way to save the world is to terrify it into submission? The old Hercules would have hesitated, would have looked for another way, would have tried to find a solution that didn't require him to become the very thing he had spent his life fighting. The new Hercules simply smiled and raised his weapon. What happened in that subterranean chamber would never be fully recorded in any official history. The screams that echoed up from the depths of the earth were heard for miles around, but no witness survived to describe their source. When Hercules finally emerged from Echidna's lair 3 days later, he was alone, and something fundamental about the world had changed. The age of heroes, with all its noble sacrifices and glorious victories, had ended. The age of the hunter had begun, and somewhere in the depths of the underworld, Nessus's laughter grew louder, because he had achieved something even more magnificent than he had originally planned. He hadn't just destroyed Hercules, he had transformed him into something that would make the Centaur's own cruelties look like children's games. The encounter at the river had been just the beginning. The real masterpiece was still unfolding. One calculated move at a time, in a game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of civilization itself. But that transformation, that final evolution from hero to something far more dangerous, would prove to be just another chapter in a story that was growing darker and more complex with each passing year. Because even the best laid plans can have unintended consequences, and even the most carefully crafted revenge can spiral beyond its creator's control. The monster that Hercules was becoming would soon discover that there were forces in the world even more patient, even more cunning, even more ruthless than a dying centaur's hatred. And when those forces finally revealed themselves, the real war would begin, a war that would make everything we've discussed so far look like a gentle disagreement between friends. But before we dive into that cosmic conflict, we need to understand something crucial about what Hercules had become. This wasn't just a man who had snapped under pressure. This wasn't some temporary madness that would fade with time and healing. What emerged from Echidna's lair was a fundamental reimagining of what power could accomplish when it was no longer constrained by mercy. You see, the old Hercules had always been reactive. Monster appears, hero responds. City in danger, hero arrives to save the day. It was a pattern as predictable as the sunrise, and it had one fatal flaw. It allowed evil to set the terms of engagement. It meant that innocent people had to suffer first before help would arrive. The new Hercules had learned to be proactive. Within weeks of Echidna's death, reports began filtering in from across the Mediterranean. Ancient threats that had lurked in the shadows for centuries were suddenly being eliminated with surgical precision. Creatures that had terrorized entire regions for generations were found dead in their lairs, killed with such efficiency that they never had a chance to call for help or warn their kin. But here's what made it truly terrifying. Hercules wasn't just hunting the monsters that were actively causing problems. He was hunting the ones that might cause problems in the future. Creatures that had been content to remain hidden, beings that had lived peacefully in remote areas for millennia, suddenly found themselves face to face with a predator who had decided that their very existence was unacceptable. It was genocide disguised as heroism, and the worst part, it was working. For the first time in recorded history, ordinary people could travel the roads without fear. Merchants no longer needed armed escorts to transport their goods. Children could play in forests that had been death traps for generations. The monster population of the known world was being systematically exterminated by a single individual who had decided that coexistence was no longer an option. The gods watched this development with growing alarm, not because they cared about the monsters, mind you. Most of those creatures had been created as pawns in divine games, disposable tools to be used and discarded at will. What worried the immortals was the precedent being set. If a half-mortal could decide that entire categories of beings had no right to exist, what was to stop him from expanding that philosophy? If monsters today, why not minor gods tomorrow? Why not major ones the day after that? But their attempts to intervene only made things worse. When Zeus sent a delegation of lesser deities to reason with his son, Hercules listened politely to their concerns, nodded thoughtfully, and then asked them a simple question that cut to the heart of everything. In all the centuries you've ruled this world, how many innocent mortals have died because you chose entertainment over protection? The silence that followed was answer enough, because that's what Hercules had finally understood about the cosmic order. It wasn't designed to protect the innocent or punish the guilty. It was designed to provide amusement for beings so powerful and long-lived that ordinary mortal concerns had become meaningless to them. Wars, plagues, monster attacks, all of it was just theater performed for an audience of immortals who had forgotten what it meant to suffer. Well, he was about to remind them. The campaign that followed would later be known as the Divine Reckoning, though no official histories would record it accurately. Too many powerful interests had reasons to suppress the truth about what really happened during those dark months when the son of Zeus declared war on heaven itself. It started with the minor deities, the ones responsible for specific types of disasters. The god of earthquakes, who had been carelessly destroying cities for millennia, found his divine essence scattered to the winds. The goddess of plague, who had treated mortal suffering as artistic expression, discovered that even immortals could be made to beg for mercy. One by one, Hercules worked his way up the divine hierarchy, each elimination more shocking than the last. He didn't kill them in combat, didn't challenge them to honorable duels or tests of strength. He hunted them like the monsters they had created, using their own tactics against them, turning their arrogance into vulnerability. The goddess Ate, who specialized in driving mortals to destructive madness, was trapped in a maze of her own making, forced to experience every moment of insanity she had ever inflicted on others. The god Limos, who had caused famines for sport, was bound in chains that slowly drained his divine essence, while he experienced the agony of eternal starvation. But it was his treatment of Eris, the goddess of discord, that truly demonstrated how far Hercules had fallen into darkness. Eris had been responsible for countless wars, manipulating mortals into conflicts that served no purpose beyond her own amusement. She had torn apart families, destroyed kingdoms, orchestrated betrayals that had shaped the course of history. When Hercules finally cornered her, She expected the quick death that her fellow deities had received. Instead, he gave her something far worse. He trapped her in a prison of perfect harmony. Using magic learned from the very monsters he had slain, Hercules created a pocket dimension where discord was impossible. Every thought was perfectly balanced, every emotion in complete equilibrium. For a being whose very existence depended on conflict and chaos, it was a torture more exquisite than any physical pain. And he left her there, conscious and aware, to experience an eternity of the peace she had spent millennia destroying. The message was clear. Hercules wasn't just eliminating threats. He was crafting punishments that fit the crimes, demonstrating a level of psychological sophistication that made even the Furies pause in admiration. This was justice, but justice without mercy, without forgiveness, without any of the compassion that had once defined heroism. The major gods finally began to take notice when Ares, the god of war himself, disappeared without a trace. Here was a deity who should have been able to match Hercules in combat, a immortal warrior with eons of experience and unlimited divine power. Yet somehow, the half-mortal son of Zeus had managed to eliminate him so completely that even his divine essence couldn't be detected. That's when they realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. Not just a rogue hero, but a being who had learned to fight on their level using weapons they didn't understand. Because Hercules had discovered something that the gods had forgotten in their arrogance. Immortality was not invincibility. Divine power was not unlimited. And every supernatural being, no matter how ancient or mighty, had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone patient enough to find them. The knowledge he had gained from studying monster genealogies had revealed the hidden connections between all supernatural entities. He understood now how divine power flowed, where it originated, how it could be interrupted or redirected. Most importantly, he had learned that the gods' greatest strength, their emotional detachment from mortal concerns, was also their greatest vulnerability. They had become so removed from human experience that they couldn't understand human desperation. They couldn't comprehend the lengths to which a mortal would go when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. They still thought in terms of rules and traditions and cosmic balance. Hercules thought in terms of total war. The first direct confrontation came when Hera herself finally descended from Olympus to face her stepson. The goddess who had tormented him since birth, who had driven him to kill his first family, who had orchestrated the curse that had defined his entire existence, finally decided to end their conflict personally. She found him waiting in the ruins of Ares' temple, standing amid the scattered remnants of what had once been considered indestructible divine architecture. He didn't seem surprised to see her. If anything, he looked like he had been expecting her arrival. "You've become everything I always said you were," she told him, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of hatred. "A monster, a threat to the natural order, a mistake that should never have been allowed to exist." Hercules nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her words with genuine interest. "You know what's funny about that?" he replied. "You're absolutely right. I am a monster now, but I'm a monster you created." He gestured to the destruction around them, the evidence of his systematic dismantling of the divine hierarchy. "Every act of cruelty you inflicted, every moment of suffering you orchestrated, every innocent life you destroyed in your petty jealousy over my father's infidelity, all of it led to this moment." His smile was cold enough to freeze the blood of mortals. "You wanted to turn me into a weapon. Congratulations. Mission accomplished." The battle that followed shook the foundations of reality itself. Hera unleashed power that had been accumulating for millennia, divine fury that could have reduced entire continents to ash. She struck with the force of cosmic justice, with the authority of the natural order itself, with magic that predated the creation of the world. Hercules met her attack with something far more dangerous. He fought with the calculated precision of a being who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Every move was designed not just to cause damage, but to demonstrate that even the Queen of Heaven was not beyond his reach. The fight raged across dimensions, through layers of reality that mortals couldn't even perceive. It carved scars into the fabric of existence that would take eons to heal. It redefined what was possible when unlimited power met unlimited determination. And when it was over, when the echoes of their conflict finally faded into silence, only one figure remained standing amid the wreckage. Hera lay broken at his feet, her immortal essence flickering like a candle in a hurricane. She wasn't dead exactly. Gods couldn't die in any conventional sense. But she had been reduced to something barely above a mortal, stripped of most of her power, her divine authority scattered to the winds. "This is what you taught me," Hercules said, looking down at the being who had shaped his entire existence through hatred and manipulation. "That power is the only truth that matters. That mercy is weakness. That the strong have not just the right, but the responsibility to dominate the weak." He knelt beside her, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Thank you for the lesson. I've learned it well." What he did next would have horrified the old Hercules, the hero who had once wept over the necessity of violence. But that man was gone, replaced by something that understood the universe in terms that gods found terrifyingly familiar. He didn't kill Hera. Death would have been mercy, and mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Instead, he bound her with chains forged from her own divine essence, trapping her in a prison of crystallized time where she would experience every moment of suffering she had ever inflicted on others. Not just the pain she had caused him, but every act of cruelty she had committed throughout her eternal existence. Every mortal driven to madness by her jealousy, every family destroyed by her petty vengeances, every innocent life lost to her games of divine politics. She would feel it all, simultaneously and eternally, until she truly understood the weight of what she had done. It was justice. It was also the most exquisite torture ever conceived by mortal or immortal mind. And as Hercules walked away from the ruins of what had once been the most powerful goddess in the pantheon, leaving her to her eternal education in empathy, he realized something that should have terrified him. He felt nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, no sense of completion or victory. Just the cold, mechanical recognition that another task had been completed successfully. Nessus had done his work well. The Centaur's poison had destroyed more than just Deianira's trust or Hercules' capacity for love. It had eliminated his ability to feel human emotions at all. What remained was pure intellect, divine strength, and an understanding of power that made him more dangerous than any force the world had ever known. The age of heroes was truly dead. What had replaced it was something that would make the gods themselves pray for the return of the monsters they had once created for entertainment, because at least monsters were predictable. At least they followed their nature, acted according to comprehensible motivations, could be reasoned with, or bargained with, or defeated through conventional means. But what do you call a being with the power of a god, the knowledge of the ages, and the absolute certainty that the universe is fundamentally unjust? What do you do when that being decides that the only solution is to remake reality according to his own vision of order? You pray that someone somewhere has a plan to stop him before he succeeds. But as Hercules stood in the smoking ruins of Olympus, looking out over a world that no longer held any mysteries for him, no longer offered any challenges worth his attention, he realized that there might not be anyone left with the power to oppose him. He had won, completely, utterly, finally. And victory, he discovered, was the loneliest feeling in the universe. Somewhere in the distance, carried on winds that smelled of sulfur and burnt offerings, he could swear he heard the echo of Centaur's laughter. Nessus had achieved something beyond his wildest dreams of revenge. He hadn't just destroyed Hercules, he had turned him into something that would destroy everything else. The encounter at the river of Venus had been the first domino to fall. Everything that followed, every act of calculated violence, every systematic elimination of divine authority, every step toward absolute power, all of it could be traced back to that moment when a dying monster had smiled and pressed a vial into the hands of a trusting wife. It was the perfect revenge, not just because it had worked, but because it would never end. As long as Hercules existed, as long as his transformed nature drove him to impose his will on an imperfect universe, Nessus's victory would continue to echo through eternity. The Centaur had done more than kill a hero. He had created a force of nature that would reshape the cosmos according to the logic of absolute power. And the most beautiful part from his perspective was that Hercules would never understand what had really happened to him. He would spend forever believing that his transformation was a choice, that his embrace of darkness was a rational response to an irrational world. He would never realize that every decision, every justification, every step toward ultimate power had been choreographed by a creature whose hatred had transcended death itself. The monster hunter had become the monster, just as planned. The only question now was whether the universe could survive what he was about to become. But here's the thing about absolute power that even Hercules, in all his divine intelligence, couldn't see coming. When you eliminate every external threat, when you've systematically destroyed every force that once challenged you, you don't achieve peace. You achieve something far more dangerous. Boredom. And a bored god with unlimited power and no remaining capacity for human emotion, that's not a ruler. That's a cosmic disaster waiting to happen. The first sign of what was coming appeared in the mortal world about 6 months after Hera's imprisonment. Cities that had once struggled with crime, disease, and natural disasters suddenly found themselves dealing with problems that defied all logic. In Athens, every citizen woke up one morning speaking only in perfect iambic pentameter. In Sparta, all the warriors discovered they could only move in elaborate dance formations. These weren't natural phenomena. They weren't even magical accidents. They were experiments. You see, Hercules had solved the problem of suffering by eliminating its sources. No more monsters, no more malevolent gods, no more cosmic forces playing games with mortal lives. The world was finally safe, finally ordered, finally perfect. And perfection, he was discovering, was absolutely unbearable, so he began to tinker. Small changes at first, minor adjustments to the natural order just to see what would happen. He altered the flow of rivers, rearranged mountain ranges, experimented with the fundamental laws of physics like a child playing with toys. The mortals below adapted as best they could, assuming these strange phenomena were just another aspect of life in a world ruled by incomprehensible forces. They had no idea that their former savior was slowly descending into a madness that would make his original curse seem like a gentle blessing. The transformation accelerated when Hercules realized that even reshaping reality couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. Physical changes to the world were interesting for a while, but they lacked something essential. They lacked stakes. They lacked the possibility of failure that had once made his labors meaningful. That's when he began his greatest and most terrible experiment. If the world lacked sufficient challenges for someone of his power, then perhaps it was time to create some new ones. Not monsters in the traditional sense, but something far more sophisticated, something that could actually threaten him. He started by studying the deepest mysteries of existence, delving into secrets that even the oldest gods had never dared to explore. The fundamental forces that held reality together, the delicate balance between creation and destruction, the thin barriers that separated one universe from another. What he found there, in the spaces between worlds, would have driven a normal mind instantly insane. Entities that existed outside of time and space, being so alien that their very presence could unravel the fabric of existence. They were the things that gods had nightmares about, the ultimate predators that fed on reality itself. And Hercules looked at them and saw exactly what he needed. Worthy opponents. The summoning ritual he devised was a masterpiece of magical engineering, drawing on knowledge stolen from every divine source he had eliminated. It required sacrifices on a scale that would have been unthinkable to his former self. Entire cities' worth of life force, channeled through crystallized time and concentrated divine essence. He chose his sacrifices carefully. Not innocence, never innocence. That would have violated the twisted moral code he still maintained. Instead, he selected the corrupt, the cruel, the ones who had caused suffering through their own choices. Tyrants, slavers, those who had grown fat on others' misery. In his mind, he was still a hero. He was eliminating evil while simultaneously powering a ritual that would bring meaning back to his existence. It was elegant, efficient, perfectly justified. It was also completely insane. The first entity that answered his call was something that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. A being of pure malevolence that had been devouring universes since before the concept of time had meaning. It looked at the reality Hercules had created, at the ordered world where suffering had been minimized and justice had been perfected, and it laughed. Not with voice or sound, but with a vibration that shook the foundations of existence itself. Because it understood something that Hercules, for all his intelligence, had missed completely. Order was just another form of chaos. Control was just another type of destruction. And the being that thought it had transcended its nature had actually embraced it more completely than ever before. The entity didn't attack Hercules directly. That would have been too simple, too straightforward. Instead, it began to corrupt the very concept of heroism itself. Every act of protection became an act of oppression. Every moment of peace became a prelude to violence. Every gesture of love became a seed of betrayal. It was doing to the entire universe what Nessus had done to Hercules personally, using the very thing that people valued most against them, turning their greatest strengths into instruments of their own destruction. And Hercules, watching this cosmic corruption unfold, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not horror, not regret, but excitement. Finally, he was facing a challenge worthy of his abilities. An opponent that could match him in cunning, in patience, in the willingness to sacrifice everything for ultimate victory. The war that followed would reshape not just their universe, but the fundamental nature of reality across multiple dimensions. It was a conflict fought with weapons forged from collapsed stars and strategies that spanned millennia. Entire galaxies became casualties. Billions of lives snuffed out as collateral damage in a game that only two players truly understood. But here's what makes this story so perfectly, horribly complete. The entity that Hercules was fighting wasn't really his enemy. It was his reflection. Everything he had become, every choice he had made, every justification he had crafted for his actions, it was all mirrored in this cosmic predator that fed on suffering and called it order. He was fighting himself. And winning was impossible because victory would mean acknowledging what he had become. Losing was unthinkable because that would mean everything he had sacrificed, everyone he had killed, all of it had been for nothing. So the war continued, and continues still, according to some who claim to have glimpsed the spaces between realities. Two godlike beings, locked in eternal combat, each convinced of their righteousness, each blind to the fact that they had become indistinguishable from the forces they originally sought to oppose. Meanwhile, in the mortal world far below, new heroes began to emerge. Men and women who had grown up in the shadow of Hercules' reign, who had seen what happened when power was concentrated in the hands of someone who believed they knew what was best for everyone else. These new champions were different from the heroes of old. They didn't seek glory or divine favor or the adoration of crowds. They had learned the hardest lesson that mythology had to teach, that the greatest enemy of justice isn't evil, it's the certainty that you're doing good. They worked in shadows, formed networks of mutual support, shared power instead of hoarding it. They had seen what happened when someone tried to save the world single-handedly, and they were determined never to repeat that mistake. And sometimes, when the cosmic battle between Hercules and his dark reflection created cracks in reality, when fragments of their war spilled over into the mortal realm, these new heroes would stand against forces that dwarfed anything their predecessors had ever faced. They would fail more often than they succeeded. They would make mistakes, suffer losses, watch innocent people die because they weren't strong enough or smart enough or fast enough to save everyone. But they would try, and they would try together. And in trying, in accepting their limitations while still fighting against injustice, they would prove something that Hercules had forgotten in his transformation, from hero to monster to god to cosmic force of nature. That the measure of a hero isn't their power, it's their humanity. The story of Nessus and Hercules, the tale of revenge that transcended death itself, had become something larger than either of its original participants could have imagined. It had become a lesson written across the stars, a warning carved into the fundamental structure of reality. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the most dangerous corruption of all is the kind that convinces you it isn't corruption at all, but enlightenment. Somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, the laughter of a long-dead centaur still echoes, because Nessus achieved something even greater than perfect revenge. He created perfect irony. The hero became the villain, the savior became the destroyer, and the man who sought to eliminate suffering became the source of suffering on a cosmic scale. And the most beautiful part of all, Hercules still thinks he's the good guy. That's the real poison that Nessus injected into the world. Not just the venom that killed Deianira, not just the jealousy that drove her to attempt murder, but the certainty that followed. The unshakable conviction that whatever you do in service of your cause is justified, no matter how many innocents suffer, no matter how much you have to sacrifice of your own humanity. It's a poison that doesn't just kill the body, it kills the soul while leaving the mind intact to rationalize every atrocity as necessary, every cruelty as kindness, every step toward damnation as progress toward salvation. The encounter at the River Evenus wasn't just about one hero's fall from grace. It was about the fundamental question that every person with power must answer. Do you serve justice, or do you force justice to serve you? Hercules chose wrong, and the universe is still paying the price. But that's not the end of the story, because even now, in the mortal world below, children are being born who will grow up to face their own moments of choice, their own rivers to cross, their own monsters to fight, their own temptations to embrace the darkness in service of the light. Some of them will remember the cautionary tale of the greatest hero who ever lived. Some of them will learn from his mistakes, will choose differently, will find ways to fight evil without becoming it. And some of them won't. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will. Heroes rise, heroes fall, and the universe watches to see which way the scales will tip this time. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Face our choices, accept the consequences, and hope that when the final accounting is made, we'll be remembered for what we tried to save rather than what we destroyed along the way. The story of Hercules and Nessus is a tragedy, but it's also a warning, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones with claws and fangs and obvious malice. They're the ones who look like heroes, who speak of justice and protection and the greater good, who convince themselves that their noble ends justify any means necessary. They're the ones who smile as they destroy the world, secure in the knowledge that they're saving it. And somewhere, in the dark spaces between the stars, Nessus laughs and laughs and laughs. Because that's the truth that ancient audiences never wanted to face, and it's the truth we still struggle with today. The monsters in our stories aren't just warnings about external threats. They're mirrors, reflecting back the darkness that lives inside all of us, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Nessus understood this better than anyone. He knew that the real battle wasn't between good and evil, but between the person you are and the person you could become under the right circumstances. He didn't need to overpower Hercules physically. He just needed to create the perfect storm of love, fear, and circumstance that would transform the greatest hero in history into something unrecognizable. And here's what makes it even more chilling. Every step of Hercules' transformation felt reasonable at the time. Protecting his wife from a monster? Of course. Seeking justice for her death? Understandable. Eliminating threats before they could harm others? Logical. Each decision built naturally on the last, creating a path that seemed noble even as it led straight into the abyss. That's the real genius of what Nessus accomplished. He didn't just destroy one man. He created a template, a blueprint for how any hero could be corrupted. Take their greatest virtue, put it under enough pressure, and watch as it transforms into their greatest weakness. Love becomes possessiveness. Justice becomes vengeance. Protection becomes control. And before you know it, the person who started out trying to save the world is the one burning it down. Think about that the next time you're absolutely certain you're doing the right thing. The next time you're willing to cross a line because the cause is just. The next time you find yourself thinking that the ends justify the means, no matter how dark those means might be, because that's exactly what Hercules was thinking when he bound Hera in chains of crystallized time. That's exactly what he was feeling when he summoned cosmic entities that fed on reality itself. He was saving the world. He was protecting the innocent. He was doing what needed to be done. Sound familiar? The scariest part about studying ancient mythology isn't the monsters or the gods or the impossible labors. It's recognizing yourself in the stories. It's seeing how easily the heroes become villains, how quickly salvation becomes damnation, how thin the line really is between protecting people and controlling them. Nessus knew this. He counted on it. His revenge wasn't just about hurting one specific person. It was about proving that heroism itself was a lie, that given enough pressure, anyone could be broken, anyone could be turned, anyone could become the very thing they once fought against. And the most terrifying part? He was right. The encounter at the River Evenus teaches us something that no amount of modern psychology or philosophy can fully prepare us for. It shows us that our greatest strengths really can become our greatest weaknesses, that love really can be weaponized against us, and that sometimes the people trying to save us are the ones we should fear most. But it also teaches us something else, something that even Nessus, in all his cunning, couldn't have anticipated. The story survived. The warning was preserved. and every generation that hears it has the chance to make different choices. We can't guarantee that we'll never face our own river crossing, our own moment of temptation, our own encounter with the forces that want to corrupt what we hold most dear. But we can remember what happened to the greatest hero who ever lived when he forgot that heroism isn't about power, it's about restraint. It's about knowing when to stop. It's about accepting that sometimes the price of saving everything is becoming something that the world needs to be saved from. The real tragedy of Hercules isn't that he fell, it's that he fell while still believing he was rising. The real horror of Nessus isn't that he was evil, it's that he was patient enough to let his victims destroy themselves while thinking they were doing good. And the real lesson of their encounter isn't about monsters or heroes or ancient Greece. It's about us, about the choices we make when we think no one is watching, about the lines we cross when we're convinced it's for the greater good, about the moment when we stop asking whether we should do something and start focusing only on whether we can. That's when the Centaur wins. That's when the poison takes hold. That's when the hero becomes the monster, one justified decision at a time. So the next time you're faced with an impossible choice, the next time you're tempted to take the easy path because it serves a noble cause, remember the man who could have been the greatest hero in history. Remember what he became instead, and ask yourself, what would Nessus want you to do? Then do the opposite, because in the end, that might be the only way to win a game that was rigged from the very beginning, not by being stronger or smarter or more powerful than your enemies, but by refusing to play by rules that were designed to corrupt you. The river still flows, the choice is still yours. Choose wisely. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of mythology's darkest corners. If this kind of deep dive into the psychological horror hiding behind ancient legends resonates with you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got so many more stories to explore, and trust me, they only get stranger from here. What other mythological encounters would you like to see dissected? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and remember, in a world full of heroes and monsters, sometimes the scariest question isn't which one you're facing, it's which one you're becoming. And here's what makes the Hercules Nessus encounter even more chilling when you really think about it. This wasn't some cosmic accident or divine intervention gone wrong. This was a masterclass in psychological warfare executed by a creature who understood something that most of us never want to acknowledge. Evil doesn't usually announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It comes disguised as solutions to our problems. It offers to carry our burdens. It promises to make everything better if we just trust it, just this once. Nessus didn't attack Hercules with claws and fangs. He attacked him with kindness, with reasonable solutions to real problems, with the promise that he could make Hercules' life easier, safer, happier. And when that didn't work, he pivoted to attacking through the one person Hercules trusted most, because that's how predators work. They don't break down your defenses, they find ways to make you lower them voluntarily. Think about every horror movie you've ever watched. The really scary ones aren't about monsters jumping out of closets. They're about the friendly neighbor who's been planning your demise for months, the helpful stranger who knows exactly what you need to hear, the trusted friend who's been working against you all along. Nessus was all of these things rolled into one perfectly designed psychological weapon. He was the ultimate insider threat, the enemy who gets close enough to study your weaknesses, learn your patterns, and strike at the perfect moment when you're most vulnerable. But here's the part that should keep you awake at night. He didn't need supernatural powers to do it. He didn't need divine magic or cosmic authority. All he needed was patience, observation, and a deep understanding of human nature. Every technique he used, every manipulation he employed, every psychological trap he set, all of it could be replicated by anyone smart enough and patient enough to study their target. The vial of poison was just a prop. The real weapon was time and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment to strike. That's what makes this story so timeless and so terrifying, because while most of us will never encounter a literal centaur at a river crossing, we'll all face our own version of Nessus. The person who offers help when we're struggling, the voice that whispers what we want to hear when we're afraid, the solution that seems too good to be true but addresses our deepest fears. And just like Hercules, we'll have to decide whether to trust them, whether to accept their help, whether to believe their promises that everything will be better if we just let them carry us across whatever river we're trying to cross. The tragedy isn't that Hercules made the wrong choice. It's that from his perspective at the time, it was the only choice that made sense. He was trying to protect someone he loved. He was being responsible, careful, strategic. He was doing everything right according to the information he had. But information can be manipulated. Context can be shaped. And the person offering solutions to your problems might be the same person who created those problems in the first place. Nessus spent years, maybe decades, positioning himself at that river crossing. He studied the routes that heroes traveled. He learned their patterns, their weaknesses, their pressure points. He turned himself into the perfect trap, disguised as the perfect solution. And when Hercules finally arrived with his new wife, tired from traveling, worried about her safety, desperate to start their new life together, Nessus was ready. Not with brute force, but with exactly what Hercules needed to hear, at exactly the moment when he was most likely to believe it. That's the level of planning and patience that real evil employs. It doesn't rely on luck or chance. It creates opportunities. It shapes circumstances. It turns your own virtues into the weapons that will destroy you. And the most insidious part? It makes you grateful for the privilege of being destroyed. Deianira thanked Nessus as he was dying. She believed she was receiving a gift, a magical insurance policy against future heartbreak. She had no idea that she was accepting the instrument of her own destruction and her husband's damnation. How many times in our own lives do we thank the people who are slowly poisoning us? How often do we express gratitude to those who are systematically undermining our happiness, our relationships, our sense of self? The answer is more often than we'd like to admit. Because psychological manipulation, when done skillfully, feels like help. It feels like care. It feels like someone finally understanding what we need and being willing to provide it. Nessus understood that the best way to control someone isn't to overpower them, it's to make them believe that your goals and their goals are the same, that what's good for you is good for them, that they need you more than you need them. He turned Hercules' love for Deianira into a weakness. He turned Deianira's love for Hercules into a weapon. And he did it all while maintaining the fiction that he was trying to help them both. That's the real horror of this story. Not the physical violence or the supernatural elements, but the quiet, patient corruption of everything good and pure and meaningful in two people's lives. The systematic transformation of love into fear, trust into suspicion, hope into despair. And it worked so perfectly that even centuries later, we're still talking about it. Still trying to understand how someone so clever and strong and fundamentally good could be brought so low by something that started with such a simple, reasonable request. Can you carry my wife across this dangerous river? 7 words that changed the course of history. 7 words that set in motion a chain of events that would transform the greatest hero who ever lived into something that would make the gods themselves tremble with fear. 7 words that prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the most dangerous questions are often the ones that sound perfectly innocent when you first hear them. So the next time someone offers to help you across your river, whatever that river might be, remember Hercules, remember Deianira. Remember that sometimes the person offering to carry you to safety is actually carrying you towards your doom. And remember that the best way to honor their memory isn't to become paranoid or suspicious of everyone around you. It's to stay awake, stay aware, and never ever forget that the most beautiful traps are the ones that look exactly like the solutions to all your problems. Because somewhere out there, in whatever form they take in our modern world, the descendants of Nessus are still waiting by their rivers, still offering to help weary travelers reach the other side, still smiling as they plan your destruction, still patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The question isn't whether you'll encounter them. The question is whether you'll recognize them before it's too late. Sweet dreams, everyone. And the next time you're crossing a river, literal or metaphorical, maybe think twice about who you trust to carry you across. The water might look dangerous, but sometimes the real threat is the one offering to keep you dry. That's all for tonight's journey into the darkness. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another corner of mythology that might just change how you look at the world forever. Stay curious, stay skeptical, And most importantly, stay human. Because in a universe full of monsters disguised as heroes and heroes transformed into monsters, our humanity might be the only compass we have left. Until next time.